Broken Western Vows. Caroline Tate had spent years ignoring the warnings about men like Jack Slade drifters with silver tongues and too many sins on their hands. But when he pulled her into the shadows of the barn, his hands rough against hers, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, darlin'," he murmured. "And I might just take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Silver Creek. The wind carried more than just dust through Silver Creek. That year it carried whispers. Whispers about Caroline Tate, the widow of the late Sheriff Thomas Tate, a man who had been as sturdy and unyielding as the ancient oak outside their modest home. Now, that oak stood sentinel over an empty porch, its leaves rustling with secrets Caroline couldn't quite decipher. She was 57, her hair streaked with silver that mirrored the creek's namesake, her face etched with the kind of lines that spoke of laughter, loss, and a resilience forged in the crucible of frontier life. Caroline ran her hand over the worn, smooth wood of the porch railing, a familiar comfort in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. Thomas had been gone for 2 years, taken not by a bullet, as so many lawmen were, but by a fever that had swept through the town with the ferocity of a prairie fire. He'd left her with the ranch, a modest spread that bordered the sprawling and often troublesome Barquet Ranch, and a heart full of memories that were both a blessing and a curse. She'd spent her life being the steadfast one, the quiet strength behind Thomas's booming presence. Now, silence was her constant companion, broken only by the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, and the incessant whispers that seemed to swirl around her like the ever-present dust devils. Those whispers weren't just about her grief, they were about him. Jack Slade. The name itself was a gust of wind, carrying with it the scent of danger and something undeniably alluring. He drifted into Silver Creek a few weeks prior, a man with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a smile that promised trouble as easily as it promised pleasure. He'd hired on at the Barquet, working as a wrangler, but his reputation had arrived well before him. A drifter, they said. A gambler. A man who lived by his own code, a code that often clashed with the unspoken laws of Silver Creek. Caroline had seen him, of course. Everyone in Silver Creek had. He had a way of moving, a slow, deliberate grace that suggested both power and a barely contained wildness. He'd tipped his hat to her once, outside the general store, his gaze lingering a moment longer than was proper. It had sent a shiver down her spine, a sensation she hadn't felt in years, a mixture of apprehension and something she hadn't dared to name. Her daughter, Sarah, who lived in the neighboring town of Dust Devil Junction, had warned her about him. Sarah, ever practical and protective, had written in her last letter, "Mama, stay clear of that Jack Slade. Men like him bring nothing but heartache." Caroline had folded the letter, the paper thin and fragile in her hands, and placed it in her worn Bible, a bookmark of sorts, a constant reminder of the boundaries she was supposed to keep. But boundaries, like fences on the open range, were sometimes meant to be tested. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the vast expanse of the plains in hues of orange and purple. Caroline watched the colors shift, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness settle in her chest. She missed Thomas, missed his steady presence, his easy laughter, the way he'd filled the silences with his stories. But she also felt a stirring, a flicker of something she thought had been extinguished long ago. A yearning for something more. She thought about the way Jack Slade had looked at her, the intensity in his gaze. It wasn't the respectful, pitying look she'd grown accustomed to from the townsfolk. It was something else entirely. Something that made her heart beat a little faster, something that made her feel alive. It was foolish, of course. She was a respectable widow, a woman of a certain age, a pillar of the Silver Creek community. He was a drifter, a man with a past shrouded in shadow, a man who could disrupt the carefully constructed order of her life. Yet, as she stood there on the porch, the whispers of the wind swirling around her, she couldn't deny the pull. It was a dangerous pull, a reckless pull, but it was a pull nonetheless. And as the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in the deep indigo of twilight, Caroline Tate knew that the whispers of Silver Creek were about to become a roar. She was about to be tested. The quiet life was going, and she felt the shift begin, the slow burn to a bigger fire. Chapter 2. Shadows in the barn. The scent of hay, horses, and old leather hung heavy in the air of the barn, a familiar and comforting aroma that had always grounded Caroline. Tonight, however, the familiar scents were tinged with an undercurrent of tension, a nervous energy that crackled like static electricity before a storm. She'd come to check on a mare due to foal, her lantern casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted across the rough-hewn wooden walls. The mare, a gentle chestnut named Belle, shifted restlessly in her stall, her flanks heaving with the effort of impending labor. Caroline spoke to her in soothing tones, stroking her velvety nose, trying to project a calmness she didn't entirely feel. Her mind kept drifting back to the encounter outside the general store, to the way Jack Slade's eyes had held hers, the unspoken challenge, the undeniable spark. A sound from the back of the barn, a soft footfall on the straw-covered floor, made her heart jump. She turned, holding the lantern higher, its light illuminating the shadowy recesses. He stood there, leaning against a support beam, his hat casting his face in shadow, but she recognized the silhouette, the broad shoulders, the lean, powerful build. "Mr. Slade," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her pulse was racing. "What are you doing here?" He pushed himself off the beam, taking a slow step forward, his boots crunching softly on the straw. "Just checking on the horses," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the barn. "Heard Belle was close." "She is," Caroline replied, trying to ignore the way his presence filled the space, the way his proximity made her acutely aware of her own solitude, her own vulnerability. "But she doesn't need your help." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to him, close enough that she could see the glint of his eyes in the lantern light. "Maybe not," he said, his gaze holding hers. "But maybe you do." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Caroline felt a flush creep up her neck, a mixture of annoyance and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to excitement. "I managed just fine on my own, Mr. Slade," she said, her voice tighter now, her grip on the lantern handle tightening. "I always have." He smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that sent another shiver down her spine. "I'm sure you have, Mrs. Tate. But even the strongest of us need a hand sometimes." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the lantern handle. His fingers were calloused, rough from years of working with ropes and horses, but his touch, when it finally came, was surprisingly gentle. He didn't take the lantern, but rather let his fingers graze hers. "I'm off air in that hand, Caroline," he said. This time it wasn't Mrs. Tate. It was her given Christian name. Caroline pulled her hand back, as if she'd been burned. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Slade." "It's not charity," he said, his voice still low, his eyes unwavering. "It's an offer, a neighborly gesture." "We're not neighbors," she retorted, her voice sharper now, her defenses rising. "You work for the Bar K. I own this land." "Fences don't mean much out here, Caroline," he said, his gaze sweeping around the barn, taking in the worn stalls, the weathered tools, the silent testament to years of hard work and resilience. "We're all just trying to survive." His words struck a chord, resonating with the truth of their shared existence in this harsh, unforgiving land. She knew he was right. The boundaries between ranches, between people, were often blurred by the common struggle for survival. But she couldn't afford to let her guard down, not with him. Belle whinnied softly, her body tensing again. Caroline turned her attention back to the mare, grateful for the distraction. "She's close," she said, her voice softening as she addressed the animal. "Just a little while longer, girl." Jack Slade remained silent, watching her, his presence a palpable weight in the small space. He didn't offer to help again, but he didn't leave either. He simply stood there, a silent, watchful presence, a shadow in the barn, a reminder of the whispers that had followed him into Silver Creek and the undeniable pull he exerted on her. Caroline knew she should send him away, should tell him to leave her and Belle in peace. But she didn't. A part of her, a part she'd tried to bury for so long, wanted him to stay. And as the mare's labor intensified, as the first signs of the new foal began to appear, Caroline Tate found herself caught between the shadows of her past and the uncertain promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. And she was keenly aware that Jack Slade wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 3. An Invitation and a Warning. The foal arrived, a sleek, dark colt, its legs wobbly as it struggled to stand. Caroline, her hands stained with birth, felt a familiar surge of wonder and relief. She delivered countless foals over the years, but each new life still felt like a miracle, a testament to the enduring power of nature. Jack Slade had remained silent throughout the birthing, a respectful distance maintained, yet his presence had been a steady anchor in the emotional storm. He'd fetched water, held the lantern steady when her hands were occupied, and offered a quiet strength that surprised her. Now, as the colt nuzzled its mother, finding its first meal, he spoke. "He's a strong one," he said, his voice low and admiring. "Got his mother's spirit." Caroline nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "He does." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd entered the barn. The lantern light softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a weariness around his eyes, a hint of vulnerability that she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, the words sincere. "For your help." He shrugged, a slight, almost self-conscious gesture. "Wasn't much." "It was enough," she insisted. She wiped her hands on a clean rag, feeling the exhaustion seep into her bones. I appreciate it." An awkward silence settled between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the mare and her newborn colt. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced by a fragile, hesitant understanding. He broke the silence, a tilt in his brow to accompany the words. "There's a dance in town Saturday night," he said, the words seemingly casual, but his eyes held a question. "At the town hall." Caroline was taken aback. It was an invitation, plain and simple, and it sent a flutter of surprise, and yes, a touch of excitement, through her. She hadn't been to a dance since Thomas, she hadn't even considered it. I don't know," she stammered, her mind racing. It was improper, unthinkable, for a widow in her position to attend a dance with a man like Jack Slade. The whispers would become a roar. The judgment of the town would be swift and harsh. "It's just a dance, Caroline," he said, his voice gentle, as if sensing her hesitation. "A chance to get to know each other better." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. She looked at him, at the way the lantern light played on his features, at the hint of hope in his eyes, and she felt a familiar conflict tearing at her. The desire for companionship, for connection, warred with the ingrained sense of propriety, the fear of judgment, the weight of her past. Before she could answer, a voice called out from outside the barn. "Caroline? You in there?" It was Jedediah, the old, grizzled foreman of her ranch, a man who had been with her and Thomas for decades, a loyal and trusted friend. His voice was laced with concern. Caroline felt a wave of relief, and also a pang of regret. Jedediah's arrival was a reprieve, a reminder of her responsibilities, of the life she had always known. "I'm here, Jedediah," she called out, her voice stronger now. "Everything's fine." Belle had her full. Jedediah entered the barn, his eyes narrowed with suspicion as he took in the scene, his gaze lingering on Jack Slade. "Slade," he said, his voice gruff, a clear warning in his tone. "What are you doing here?" "Just helping out, Jedediah," Jack replied, his voice calm, but his eyes held a flicker of defiance. "No harm done." Jedediah didn't look convinced. He turned to Caroline, his expression softening. "You all right, Caroline?" "I'm fine, Jedediah," she said, offering him a reassuring smile. "Just tired." It was a long night. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on Jack. "Best be getting back to the Barquet, Slade. We can handle things here." It was a dismissal, plain and simple, a reminder of the boundaries that existed between them, the unspoken rules that governed their lives. Jack Slade didn't argue. He simply nodded, his gaze meeting Caroline's one last time. "Good night, Caroline," he said, his voice low, intimate, a promise and a question all wrapped into one. Then, he turned and walked out of the barn, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Caroline with Jedediah's watchful gaze and the lingering echo of an invitation that could change everything. She knew she should refuse. She knew she would refuse. But a sliver of her hoped she wouldn't. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The following days passed in a blur of chores, restless nights, and a constant internal debate that raged within Caroline. She went about her daily routine, tending to the ranch, overseeing the hands, and maintaining the quiet, orderly life she had built for herself. But her mind was far from quiet. It was filled with images of Jack Slade, with the memory of his gentle touch, with the unspoken invitation that hung in the air between them. Jedediah's warning echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the risks involved, of the potential for scandal and heartache. He hadn't said much after Jack had left the barn, but his silence had been more telling than any words. He'd simply looked at her, his old eyes filled with concern and a hint of disapproval, and she'd known what he was thinking. "Stay away from him, Caroline. He's trouble." She knew he was right, of course. Jack Slade was everything she should avoid. He was a drifter, a gambler, a man with a shadowy past and an uncertain future. He was the antithesis of her late husband, Thomas, a man of stability, of unwavering principle, a man who had represented everything safe and predictable. Yet, despite all the logical reasons to stay away, Caroline found herself drawn to him, drawn to the danger, to the unknown, to the spark of life he had ignited within her. She'd spent years living in the shadows of grief, of routine, of expectation. Now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something else, a yearning for something more, something different. She found herself making excuses to ride out to the far reaches of her property, to the fence line that bordered the parquet, hoping for a glimpse of him. She'd catch sight of him working with the horses, his movements fluid and graceful, his presence radiating a raw, untamed energy. She'd watch him from a distance, her heart beating a little faster, her breath catching in her throat. She knew it was foolish, dangerous even, but she couldn't seem to help herself. It was as if a part of her, a part she'd kept buried for so long, had awakened, and it refused to be silenced. One afternoon, she found herself in the general store, stocking up on supplies. Martha, the store owner, a woman with a sharp tongue and a keen eye for gossip, greeted her with a knowing smile. "Heard you had some help the other night, Caroline," Martha said, her voice laced with innuendo. "That Jack Slade is quite the charmer, isn't he?" Caroline felt her cheeks flush. "He was just being neighborly, Martha," she said, trying to sound dismissive. Belle was having trouble foaling. Martha chuckled. "Neighborly, huh? That's one word for it. Folks are talking, Caroline. You know how Silver Creek is." Caroline knew all too well. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a widow and a drifter were prime fodder for the rumor mill. She sighed, feeling the weight of unspoken words, of judgment and expectation, pressing down on her. "I'm not doing anything wrong, Martha," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was pounding. "Maybe not," Martha said, her eyes softening a bit. "But be careful, Caroline. Men like him, they're not always what they seem." Martha's words echoed Jedediah's warning, reinforcing the doubts that already plagued her. She left the store, the supplies feeling heavier than usual, her mind heavy with the burden of her decision. She knew she should stay away from Jack Slade. She should focus on her ranch, on her responsibilities, on the life she had always known. But as she rode back to her home, the vast, open sky above her, the wind whispering through the tall grass, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that she was standing on the precipice of a decision that could alter the course of her life forever. The unspoken words, the warnings, the expectations, they all weighed heavily on her, but the weight of her own desires, her own yearning for something more, was even heavier. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Troubled Past. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth, the heat shimmering in waves above the dusty plains. Caroline rode along the fence line, ostensibly checking for breaks, but her gaze kept drifting towards the Barquet Ranch in the distance. She hadn't seen Jack Slade since the night in the barn, and the silence, the absence of his presence, felt strangely loud. She reined in her horse, a sturdy, reliable mare named Daisy, near a cluster of rocks, seeking a sliver of shade. Dismounting, she let Daisy graze on the sparse grass, her own thoughts a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. She was thinking about Thomas, as she often did when she was troubled. She remembered their early days, the courtship that had been more practical than passionate, the marriage that had been built on mutual respect and a shared desire for a stable life. He'd been a good man, a strong man, a man who had provided for her and protected her. But there had always been a distance between them, a quiet reserve that she'd never quite been able to breach. She wondered if he'd ever felt the same yearning she was feeling now, the same restless desire for something more. She doubted it. Thomas had been content with their life, with the predictable rhythm of their days, with the boundaries they had carefully constructed. Caroline sighed, running a hand through her hair, feeling the sweat beading on her forehead. She was different. She'd always been different. Beneath the surface of her quiet, compliant exterior, there had always been a spark of rebellion, a yearning for adventure, a desire to break free from the constraints of expectation. She'd suppressed those desires for years, burying them beneath the weight of her responsibilities, of her role as the sheriff's wife, of her place in the Silver Creek community. But now, with Thomas gone, with the whispers of Jack Slade swirling around her, those buried desires were resurfacing, demanding to be acknowledged. A movement in the distance caught her eye. A rider, approaching from the direction of the Barquet. Her heart quickened, recognizing the familiar silhouette, the easy grace in the saddle. It was Jack. He rode towards her, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust, his eyes fixed on hers. As he drew closer, she saw the lines of weariness etched on his face, the shadows that seemed to cling to him, a hint of a troubled past. He reined in his horse a few feet away, his gaze holding hers. "Caroline," he said, his voice low, a hint of surprise in his tone. "Didn't expect to see you out here." "Just checking the fences," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her pulse was racing. He nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if searching for something. "Heard about Martha's comments," he said, his voice turning gruff. "Sorry if she caused you any trouble." Caroline shrugged. "It's Silver Creek," she said. "People talk." He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and walked towards her, stopping a respectful distance away. "I don't want to cause you any trouble, Caroline," he said, his voice sincere, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that she hadn't expected. I wanted to see you again." His honesty, his vulnerability, disarmed her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and she saw more than just a drifter, more than just a gambler. She saw a man who had known hardship, who had carried burdens, who had been wounded by life. She saw a reflection of her own hidden pain, her own unspoken longing. "Why did you come to Silver Creek?" She heard herself ask him. A shadow crossed his face, a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Running," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "From my past." He was silent for a long moment, then looked at her, his jaw tight. "There was trouble. Back in Abilene. A card game. A man died." Caroline's breath caught in her throat. It was the whisper she had heard and not heard. The unspoken truth that had followed him to Silver Creek. It was a confirmation of everything she should fear, of everything that should drive her away. It was proof he was dangerous. He looked down, clearly ashamed, and closed his eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice raw with regret. "It was self-defense, but it doesn't matter. I had to leave, had to disappear." Caroline's instinct was pull away. Fear had a brief reign, but she saw the good man. The good, hurting man. She looked at his face. She stepped forward. She placed her hand on his forearm. She didn't speak, but she hoped he knew. She wasn't running. Chapter 6. beneath a sky of secrets. His head lifted at her touch, his stormy eyes searching hers, surprised by her lack of retreat. The feel of her hand on his arm, the callous skin against his, sent a jolt through him, a warmth that spread through his chilled, weary soul. He hadn't expected kindness, not after revealing the darkness that clung to him.
Caroline,
He began, his voice rough, unsure. She didn't speak, but her eyes, the color of the prairie sky after a rain, held a compassion that he hadn't known he craved. They stood there, beneath the vast, unforgiving expanse of the western sky, two souls bound by a shared understanding of loss and longing, of secrets and regrets. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward or strained. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with a connection that transcended the whispers of the town, the boundaries of their past, the dangers of their present.
Eva.
I've killed men before, Caroline, he said, the words torn from him, a confession he'd never intended to make. In the war. And after.
It's a part of me.
A part one can't escape. Caroline nodded, her hand still resting on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, of the weight he carried. She'd known, of course. Everyone in Silver Creek had heard the rumors, the whispers about his past. But hearing it from him, seeing the raw honesty in his eyes, made it different. It made it real. Thomas. He killed men too, she said, her voice soft, her gaze drifting towards the distant horizon. In the line of duty. He never talked about it much, but I know it haunted him. Jack looked at her, surprised by her admission. He'd seen her as the proper widow, the pillar of the community, the woman who had lived a sheltered, protected life. He hadn't realized that she, too, carried scars, that she, too, understood the darkness that could reside within a man's soul. It changes you, he said, his voice low, his gaze meeting hers.
Killing.
It leaves a mark. Yes, she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. It does. They stood there for a long moment, the silence deepening, the connection between them growing stronger. The vastness of the sky above them seemed to amplify their isolation, their vulnerability, their shared understanding of the burdens they carried. I don't want to run anymore, Caroline, he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. I'm tired of running. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, seeing the sincerity in his words, the glimmer of hope that had replaced the shadows. She felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years, a feeling of protectiveness, of hope. Then don't, she said, her voice firm, her hand tightening on his arm.
Stay.
Here. In Silver Creek. He looked at her, surprised by her words, by the boldness of her offer. He'd expected rejection, condemnation, fear. He hadn't expected acceptance. You'd want me to stay? He asked, his voice hesitant, unsure. Caroline nodded, her gaze unwavering. I would, she said.
If you want to.
He searched her eyes, seeing the truth in her words, the genuine offer of friendship, of companionship, of something more. He saw a strength in her that he hadn't recognized before, a resilience that mirrored his own. I do, he said, his voice filled with a certainty that surprised even himself. I want to stay. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that transformed her, making her look younger, more vibrant, more alive. It was a smile that promised a new beginning, a chance to heal, a chance to find redemption. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains, painting the clouds in hues of orange, pink, and purple. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust, carrying the promise of a new dawn. And beneath that vast, secret-filled sky, Caroline Tate and Jack Slade stood together, two wounded souls finding solace in each other's presence, two hearts daring to hope for a future they hadn't dared to imagine. The secrets were still there, the past lingered. But something new was taking hold. Chapter 7. The Price of a Stolen Kiss. The dance at the town hall was a kaleidoscope of swirling skirts, lively fiddle music, and the murmur of conversation. Caroline hadn't intended to go. She'd spent the days since her encounter with Jack wrestling with her decision, with the implications of his staying, with the undeniable pull she felt towards him. Jedediah had pleaded with her to reconsider, his weathered face etched with worry. "Caroline, it's not right," he'd said, his voice gruff with concern. "Folks are talking. It'll ruin your reputation." Sarah had sent another letter, even more urgent than the last. "Mama, please be careful. This man is dangerous. He'll break your heart." But Caroline had made up her mind. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself, but she knew she had to see him again, had to feel the connection that had sparked between them, had to explore the possibilities that had bloomed in the barren landscape of her life. She'd chosen a simple dress, a dark blue calico that had belonged to her mother, its fabric soft and worn with age. She'd brushed her hair until it shone, the silver streaks gleaming in the lamplight, and she'd applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks, a subtle defiance against the expectations of her age, of her widowhood. When she arrived at the town hall, the music was already in full swing. The room was filled with familiar faces, with the ranchers and townsfolk she'd known her entire life. She saw the curious glances, the whispered comments, the disapproving stares. She felt the weight of their judgment, but she held her head high, her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance. She saw him across the room, leaning against a wall, his eyes searching the crowd. He was dressed in a clean shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed, but he still stood out, his presence radiating a raw energy that set him apart from the other men. When he saw her, his face lit up, a slow smile spreading across his features. He pushed himself off the wall and walked towards her, his movements graceful and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. "Caroline," he said, his voice low, a hint of surprise and pleasure in his tone. "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice a little breathless, her heart beating faster. He offered her his arm, a gesture both formal and intimate. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his shirt. They danced. It was awkward at first, their steps hesitant, their bodies stiff. But as the music swirled around them, as they found their rhythm, they began to relax, to move together, to feel the connection that had drawn them to each other. They didn't talk much, their conversation limited to polite exchanges, to observations about the music, the crowd, the weather. But their eyes spoke volumes, their glances lingering, their touches sending shivers down their spines. As the evening wore on, the whispers grew louder, the stares more intense. Caroline felt the pressure mounting, the judgment of the town closing in on her. She knew she should leave, should retreat to the safety of her home, should protect her reputation, her standing in the community. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, to the warmth of his presence, to the feeling of being alive again, of being seen, of being desired. He led her outside, onto the porch of the town hall, seeking a respite from the noise and the scrutiny. The night air was cool and crisp, the sky above them a vast expanse of stars. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the music drifting from inside, feeling the tension building between them. "They're talking about us, Caroline," he said, his voice low, his eyes filled with concern. "I don't want to cause you any more trouble." "I know," she said, her voice soft, her gaze meeting his. "But I don't care." The words surprised her, even as she spoke them. She hadn't realized how much she meant them, how much she was willing to risk, until that very moment. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the truth in her words, the defiance in her stance, the vulnerability in her heart. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her breath catching in her throat. He bent his head, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a stolen kiss, a forbidden kiss, a kiss that defied the expectations of the town, the whispers of the past, the dangers of the future. It was a kiss that sealed their fate. It was a declaration, a promise, and it had a hefty price. As they separated slightly, eyes still locked, they both heard the gasp from behind them. Standing in the doorway of the town hall was Margaret Sutter, the town's most notorious gossip, her eyes wide with shock and malice. The damage was done. Chapter 8. Dust Devils and Broken Promises. The fallout from the stolen kiss was swift and brutal. Margaret Sutter, true to form, wasted no time in spreading the news throughout Silver Creek. By the next morning, the entire town was buzzing with the scandal, the whispers turning into a roar of condemnation and disapproval. Caroline faced the storm with a mixture of defiance and despair. She'd known there would be consequences, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer venom of the town's reaction. People she'd considered friends crossed the street to avoid her, shopkeepers turned their backs, and even the children stared at her with wide, curious eyes. Jedediah, his face etched with a mixture of sadness and "I told you so," pleaded with her to end the relationship. "Caroline, you're playing with fire," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This town, they'll never accept him. They'll never forgive you." Sarah's letters became frantic, filled with pleas and warnings. "Mama, come stay with me. Leave Silver Creek. Leave him. Before it's too late." Caroline, however, remained steadfast. She'd made her choice, and she was determined to stand by it, regardless of the cost. She'd spent too many years living by other people's rules, conforming to their expectations, suppressing her own desires. She wouldn't do it anymore. Jack, for his part, felt the weight of the town's disapproval even more acutely than Caroline. He was an outsider, a drifter, a man with a past, and he knew he was the source of her troubles. He offered to leave, to disappear, to protect her from the storm he had brought upon her. "Caroline, I can't do this to you," he said, his voice filled with anguish, his eyes searching hers. "I'll go. I'll disappear. You deserve better than this." But Caroline refused. She held on to him, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes filled with a determination that mirrored his own. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We're in this together. I'm not letting you go." Their defiance, however, only fueled the fire. The town's ostracism intensified, and the whispers turned into open hostility. Someone threw a rock through her window, shattering the glass and leaving a jagged hole that mirrored the growing cracks in her life. Then came the threats. Anonymous notes, left on her doorstep, filled with ugly words and veiled warnings. "Leave town or face the consequences. He'll bring you nothing but ruin. You're a disgrace to Thomas's memory." The threats escalated. One morning, she found her prize mare, Belle, dead in the pasture, her throat slit. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, a message meant to intimidate, to break her spirit. Caroline was devastated. She'd loved Belle, had raised her from a foal, and the loss cut her deeply. She wept, her tears falling onto the mare's soft coat, her grief mingled with anger and a growing sense of fear. Jack found her there, kneeling beside Belle's lifeless body, her shoulders shaking with sobs. He knelt beside her, his arm wrapping around her, offering a silent comfort that spoke volumes. "I'm so sorry, Caroline," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I never wanted this to happen." She leaned into him, her body trembling, her grief overwhelming. She knew he was right. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted this. It was the town, their prejudice, their fear, their hatred that had caused this. "They're trying to break us, Jack," she said, her voice raw with pain. "They're trying to drive us apart." He held her tighter, his grip fierce, his eyes filled with a burning determination. "They won't," he vowed, his voice a low growl. "They won't break us. I won't let them." But even as he spoke the words, a sense of foreboding settled over them. The dust devils were swirling, the storm was gathering, and the broken promises of Silver Creek were about to unleash their full fury. The cost was rising, and they knew this was just the beginning of a greater fight. Chapter 9. Riding Towards Redemption. The killing of Belle hardened something within Caroline. The grief, while still a raw ache, was now tempered by a steely resolve. She would not be driven out. She would not be broken. She would not let the fear and prejudice of Silver Creek dictate her life. She and Jack buried Belle beneath the old oak tree, a silent ceremony marked by tears and unspoken vows. They knew they were facing a formidable enemy, a town united against them, fueled by gossip and fear. But they also knew they had something worth fighting for: their connection, their love, their chance at a new beginning. They decided to take a stand. They wouldn't hide, wouldn't cower, wouldn't run. They would face the town, together, and show them they wouldn't be intimidated. Their first act of defiance was to attend church on Sunday. It was a bold move, a direct challenge to the town's ostracism. They walked into the church, hand in hand, their heads held high, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the palpable hostility. The sermon, delivered by Reverend Johnson, a man who had once been a friend to Caroline, was pointedly aimed at them. He spoke of sin and redemption, of the dangers of straying from the righteous path, of the importance of upholding the community's values. His words were veiled accusations, thinly disguised condemnations of their relationship. Caroline and Jack sat through the sermon, their faces impassive, their hands clasped tightly together. They endured the silent judgment, the disapproving glances, the palpable tension that filled the church. After the service, they walked out, again hand in hand, their exit even more defiant than their entrance. They knew they hadn't won any hearts or minds, but they had made a statement. They wouldn't be silenced. They wouldn't be shamed. Their next step was to try and reason with the townspeople, to address their fears, to dispel the rumors. Jack, despite his past, decided to speak openly about the incident in Abilene, to explain the circumstances, to show them he wasn't the monster they believe him to be. They organized a meeting at the town hall, inviting everyone to attend. It was a risky move, a gamble that could either ease the tension or escalate the conflict. The turnout was surprisingly large. The town hall was packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation and animosity. Caroline and Jack stood on the stage, facing the crowd, their hearts pounding, their nerves on edge. Jack spoke first, his voice calm and clear, his eyes meeting the gazes of the townspeople. He told his story, honestly and without embellishment, explaining the events that had led to the fatal card game, his flight from Abilene, his arrival in Silver Creek. He spoke of his regret, of his desire to make amends, of his hope for a new life. He spoke of his love for Caroline, of his respect for her, of his commitment to her. His words were met with silence, with skepticism, with outright hostility. Some people shouted accusations, others hurled insults, others simply stared at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. Caroline then spoke, her voice strong and unwavering, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. She defended Jack. She defended their relationship. She challenged the town's prejudice and fear. She spoke of Thomas, of his respect for justice, of his belief in second chances. She spoke of her own loneliness, of her own yearning for companionship, of her right to choose her own path. Her words, like Jack's, were met with mixed reactions. Some people seemed to soften, to consider her perspective, to question their own judgment. Others remained steadfast in their opposition, their hatred fueled by fear and ignorance. The meeting ended without a resolution, without a clear victory for either side. But it was a turning point. It was the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards redemption, towards acceptance, towards a future where they could live openly and without fear. The ride was just beginning, and it was clear that the path to redemption was going to be a long and treacherous one. But they would ride it out together. Chapter 10. Scars of the Heart and Frontier. The meeting at the town hall, while not achieving immediate reconciliation, did plant seeds of doubt within the community. Some, swayed by Caroline's passionate defense and Jack's candid confession, began to question the prevailing narrative. Others, hardened by years of ingrained prejudice, remained firmly opposed. Silver Creek was a town divided, simmering with unspoken tensions. Caroline and Jack continued their lives, working the ranch, facing the daily challenges of frontier life, but now with the added burden of the town's animosity. They found solace in each other's company, their bond strengthened by the adversity they faced. Their quiet evenings, spent on the porch watching the sunset, became precious moments of peace, of shared dreams, of whispered hopes. One evening, as they sat together, the sky ablaze with color, Caroline noticed Jack tracing the lines on his weathered hand. He'd been quieter than usual, his thoughts seemingly far away. "What is it, Jack?" she asked softly, her hand reaching out to cover his. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that tugged at her heart. "I was just thinking about the scars," he said, his voice low. "The ones you can see, and the ones you can't." Caroline understood. She, too, carried scars, both visible and invisible. The lines on her face, the silver in her hair, were reminders of the years, of the hardships, of the losses she had endured. But the deeper scars, the ones etched on her heart, were the ones that truly defined her. "We all have them, Jack," she said, her voice gentle. "They're a part of who we are. They remind us of what we've survived." He nodded, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "Sometimes I feel like I'm nothing but scars," he said. "Like the past will always define me." Caroline squeezed his hand, her touch conveying a reassurance that words couldn't express. "The past shapes us, Jack, but it doesn't define us. We have a choice. We can let it consume us, or we can learn from it, grow from it, and move forward." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the strength in her gaze, the unwavering belief in her words. He'd spent so many years running from his past, from the guilt and the shame, that he'd forgotten he had a choice. He'd forgotten he could choose a different path. "I want to move forward, Caroline," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "I want to build a life here with you. A life free from the shadows of the past." Caroline smiled, her heart swelling with a love that was both fierce and tender. "We will, Jack," she said. Together. They spent the following weeks working on the ranch, preparing for the coming winter. They mended fences, repaired the barn, and stocked up on supplies. They worked side by side, their hands often brushing, their glances lingering, their unspoken connection deepening with each passing day. One afternoon, while they were working in the corral, a group of riders approached. It was a posse led by Sheriff Buckley, a man known for his harsh judgment and his unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. Caroline and Jack exchanged a worried glance. They knew this couldn't be good. Sheriff Buckley dismounted, his eyes cold and hard, his gaze sweeping over them with suspicion. "Jack Slade," he said, his voice gruff. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Caroline's heart sank. She'd feared this, had known it was a possibility, but the reality of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. "On what charges?" she asked, her voice trembling, her hand reaching out to grasp Jack's. "Aiding and abetting a known criminal," Buckley replied, his eyes fixed on Jack. "And suspicion of murder." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, casting a shadow over the sun-drenched landscape. The scars of the heart and those of the frontier were once again raw. The fight was far from over. Chapter 11. The Unforgiving Glare of Truth. The known criminal Buckley referred to was a man named Bart Higgins, a former associate of Jack's from his days in Abilene. Higgins had ridden into Silver Creek a few days prior, seeking refuge, claiming he was being pursued by bounty hunters. Jack, bound by a twisted sense of loyalty to his former comrade, had allowed him to stay in the abandoned line shack on the far edge of the Bar K property. He hadn't told Caroline. Caroline had been uneasy about Higgins's presence, sensing a darkness in him, a desperation that made her wary. She'd questioned Jack about him, but he'd been evasive, assuring her that Higgins was just passing through, that he wouldn't cause any trouble. Now, it seemed, Jack's misplaced loyalty had come back to haunt him. Higgins, it turned out, was wanted for a recent bank robbery in a neighboring town, and a witness had identified him as the one who had shot and killed a guard. Buckley's accusation of suspicion of murder was a thinly veiled attempt to implicate Jack in the crime, to use his past against him, to drive him out of Silver Creek. Jack denied any involvement in the robbery, insisting he had no knowledge of Higgins's plans. He'd helped a friend, he'd made a mistake, but he was not a murderer. Buckley, however, was unmoved. He'd always disliked Jack, had always resented his presence in Silver Creek, and now he had the perfect opportunity to get rid of him. "Take him in," Buckley ordered his deputies, his voice cold and harsh. Caroline stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger and defiance. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "He's innocent. You have no proof." Buckley ignored her, his gaze fixed on Jack. "He'll have a chance to prove his innocence in court," he said. In Dust Devil Junction. Dust Devil Junction was a 2-day ride away, a town known for its harsh judge and its swift, unforgiving justice. It was a place where a man like Jack Slade, with his past and his reputation, would stand little chance of a fair trial. Jack looked at Caroline, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. He knew he was in trouble, that the odds were stacked against him. "It's all right, Caroline," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. "I'll be fine. I'll clear my name." But Caroline knew it wouldn't be that easy. She knew the town, knew their prejudice, knew their fear. She knew they wanted Jack gone, and they wouldn't hesitate to use Higgins's crime to achieve their goal. As the deputies led Jack away, his hands bound, his head held high, Caroline felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to fight for him, to prove his innocence, to clear his name. She watched them ride away, the dust swirling around them, obscuring them from view, leaving her alone with her fears and her determination. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. She needed someone who believed in Jack, someone who was willing to fight for him, someone who could navigate the treacherous legal system of the frontier. There was only one person she could turn to, her daughter, Sarah. Sarah was a lawyer, practicing in Dust Devil Junction. She was smart, resourceful, and fiercely independent. She was also Jack's only hope. Caroline saddled her horse, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She had a long ride ahead of her, a ride filled with uncertainty and danger. But she was determined to reach Dust Devil Junction, to enlist Sarah's help, to save the man she loved. The unforgiving glare of truth was upon them, but Caroline was ready to face it, head on, for Jack. Chapter 12. A bargain struck in twilight. The ride to Dust Devil Junction was arduous, the landscape mirroring the turmoil in Caroline's heart. The vast, open plains, usually a source of solace, now seemed to stretch endlessly before her, a daunting reminder of the distance she had to travel, of the challenges she faced. She rode through the night, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope, stopping only to rest her horse and grab a few moments of fitful sleep. The image of Jack, his hands bound, his face etched with worry, haunted her every step of the way. She arrived in Dust Devil Junction at dusk, the town bathed in the soft, fading light of the setting sun. It was a bustling town, larger and more chaotic than Silver Creek, filled with saloons, gambling halls, and a general air of lawlessness. She found Sarah's office, a small, modest building on a side street, its windows glowing with lamplight. She dismounted, her legs stiff and aching, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Sarah was surprised to see her, her initial joy at her mother's unexpected arrival quickly turning to concern as Caroline explained the situation, her voice choked with emotion, her words tumbling out in a rush of fear and desperation. Sarah listened intently, her face growing pale as she heard the details of Jack's arrest, of Higgins's crime, of Buckley's accusations. She knew the legal system in Dust Devil Junction, knew the judge, knew the challenges they faced. "Oh, Mama," she said, her voice filled with concern. "This is bad. Really bad. Judge Harding is a hanging judge. He's not known for his leniency." Caroline's heart sank. She'd hoped for reassurance, for a glimmer of hope, but Sarah's words only confirmed her worst fears. "But I'll do everything I can, Mama," Sarah continued, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a determination that mirrored her mother's. "I'll defend Jack. I'll fight for him." Caroline embraced her daughter, her tears flowing freely, her gratitude overwhelming. She'd always been proud of Sarah, of her intelligence, her independence, her strength. But now, More than ever, she was grateful for her daughter's presence, for her support, for her willingness to fight for the man she loved. They spent the evening discussing the case, going over the details, formulating a strategy. Sarah was realistic, outlining the challenges they faced, the lack of evidence, the prejudice against Jack, the judge's reputation. But she was also determined, outlining her plan to challenge the witness's testimony, to expose Higgins's lies, to prove Jack's innocence. As they talked, Sarah revealed a piece of information that gave Caroline a glimmer of hope. She'd heard rumors of a connection between Sheriff Buckley and Bart Higgins, a suggestion of corruption, of a possible conspiracy. "I don't have any proof yet, Mama," Sarah said, her voice cautious. "But I have a contact, a former deputy who was dismissed by Buckley. He might know something. He might be willing to talk." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead they had. They decided to pursue it, to follow the trail of rumors, to uncover the truth, to expose the corruption that threatened to destroy Jack's life. As the twilight deepened, as the stars began to appear in the vast, inky sky, Caroline and Sarah struck a bargain, a pact forged in love and desperation. They would work together, mother and daughter, to fight for Jack, to clear his name, to bring him home. They would face the challenges ahead, the dangers, the uncertainties, with courage and determination. The bargain was sealed with a hug, with a shared look of resolve, with a whispered promise to fight until the very end. The twilight had brought them together, and in that fading light, a new hope was born, a hope that would guide them through the darkness ahead. Chapter 13. Between Law and Loyalty. Sarah's contact, a grizzled ex-deputy named Jed Harper, no relation to Caroline's foreman, lived on the outskirts of Dust Devil Junction, in a ramshackle cabin that mirrored his own weathered and worn appearance. He was a man who had seen too much, who had been betrayed by the system he had once served, and who now lived with a mixture of cynicism and regret. He was initially reluctant to talk, wary of Sarah and her questions, suspicious of her motives. He'd been burned before, and he wasn't eager to get involved in another messy situation. But Sarah, with her persistence and her genuine concern for Jack, managed to win him over. She explained the situation, outlined the evidence, and appealed to his sense of justice, to his lingering loyalty to the law, even the corrupt version of it he'd served under. "Buckley's a dirty cop," Harper finally admitted, his voice low and gruff, his eyes filled with a flicker of anger. "He's been on Higgins's payroll for years. Taking bribes, looking the other way, protecting his operations." Harper revealed that Buckley had been involved in several shady dealings, including land grabs, cattle rustling, and protection rackets. He'd used his position of power to enrich himself, to silence his enemies, and to control the town. He also confirmed Sarah's suspicion that Buckley had been involved in the bank robbery, that he'd likely provided Higgins with information, with protection, and with a plan to frame Jack. Higgins was supposed to split the take with Buckley, Harper said. But he got greedy. Decided to keep it all for himself. That's why Buckley turned on him. That's why he's so eager to pin the murder on Slade. It was a breakthrough, a crucial piece of information that could help them prove Jack's innocence. But it was also dangerous. Exposing Buckley's corruption could put them all at risk, could unleash a storm of violence and retaliation. "I can't testify in court," Harper said, his voice firm. "Buckley would kill me. He has eyes and ears everywhere." Sarah understood. She couldn't ask him to risk his life. But she needed his information, his knowledge, to build her case, to challenge Buckley's narrative, to expose his lies. They struck a deal. Harper would provide Sarah with information, with leads, with contacts, but he would remain anonymous. He would be her silent partner, her guide through the murky underworld of Dust Devil Junction. Armed with Harper's information, Sarah began to build her defense. She interviewed witnesses, gathered evidence, and pieced together a timeline of events that contradicted Buckley's version. She discovered that the witness who had identified Higgins as the shooter was a known associate of Buckley's, a man with a history of perjury and a reputation for lying. She also found evidence that Higgins had been seen in another town on the day of the robbery, making it impossible for him to have been in two places at once. She was building a strong case, a case that could potentially prove Jack's innocence. But she was also facing a formidable opponent, a corrupt sheriff with powerful allies and a ruthless determination to protect his interests. The lines between law and loyalty were becoming increasingly blurred. Sarah was walking a tightrope, balancing her commitment to justice with her loyalty to her client, to her mother, to the man they both loved. She knew the risks, knew the dangers, but she was determined to fight, to expose the truth, to bring Buckley down, to free Jack from the clutches of a corrupt system. It was a battle between law and loyalty, between justice and corruption, and the stakes were higher than ever. The fate of Jack, and perhaps their own, hung in the balance. Chapter 14. The Dance of Desire and Fear. While Sarah worked tirelessly in Dust Devil Junction, Caroline returned to Silver Creek, facing the continued hostility of the town, the constant whispers, the ever-present threat of violence. She felt isolated, vulnerable, and increasingly afraid for Jack's safety. She found solace in the routine of the ranch, in the familiar tasks of tending to the animals, of working the land. But even the simple pleasures of frontier life were tainted by the shadow of Jack's absence, by the uncertainty of his fate. Jedediah, despite his initial disapproval of their relationship, remained a steadfast ally, a loyal friend who offered his support and his protection. He kept a watchful eye on the ranch, guarding against any further threats, any attempts to harm Caroline or her property. He also served as a bridge between Caroline and the few remaining friends she had in Silver Creek, the ones who hadn't succumbed to the town's prejudice and fear. He brought her news, messages of support, and small acts of kindness that helped her endure the isolation and the hostility. One evening, as Caroline sat on the porch, watching the sunset, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness, she saw a rider approaching. It was Jack. Her heart leaped with joy, with relief, with a surge of disbelief. She ran towards him, her arms outstretched, her tears flowing freely. But as he drew closer, she realized it wasn't Jack. It was his younger brother, Caleb. He had Jack's eyes, it was unmistakable. Caleb was a younger, rougher version of Jack, his face hardened by years of hardship, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and grief. He'd heard about Jack's arrest, about the accusations, about the town's hostility, and he'd come to Silver Creek seeking answers, seeking justice, seeking revenge. He dismounted, his movements stiff and awkward, his gaze sweeping over Caroline with suspicion. "You're Caroline," he said, his voice gruff, his tone accusatory. "The woman who got my brother into this mess." Caroline felt a pang of guilt, a surge of defensiveness. She knew Caleb's anger was misplaced, that Jack was not a victim, that he had made his own choices. But she also understood his pain, his loyalty to his brother, his desire to protect him. "I love your brother, Caleb," she said, her voice soft, her eyes meeting his. "I'm doing everything I can to help him." Caleb's expression softened slightly, his anger giving way to a flicker of uncertainty. He'd expected a different woman, a woman who fit the town's description of her, a woman who had seduced his brother, who had led him astray. He hadn't expected this woman with her quiet strength, her unwavering loyalty, her genuine love for Jack. "He talk about me?" Caleb asked, and the words were rough around the edges, a clear sign of rawness. Caroline nodded.
He has. Good things.
They spent the evening talking, sharing stories about Jack, revealing their fears, their hopes, their determination to help him. Caroline told Caleb about Sarah's efforts, about the evidence she was gathering, about the possibility of exposing Buckley's corruption. Caleb, in turn, told Caroline about his and Jack's past, about the hardships they had endured, about the bond that had held them together. He spoke of his anger, of his desire for revenge, of his willingness to do whatever it took to free his brother. As they talked, a fragile alliance formed between them, a bond forged in shared love for Jack, in a shared desire for justice. They were an unlikely pair, the respectable widow and the rough-edged drifter, but they were united by a common goal, by a common determination to fight for the man they both loved. The dance of desire and fear continued, the music playing a complex melody of hope and despair, of love and loss, of courage and vulnerability. Caroline and Caleb, drawn together by circumstance, by fate, by a shared love for Jack, were now partners in this dance, their steps uncertain, their future unclear, but their determination unwavering. The unknown path stretched ahead. Chapter 15. Where Rivers Run Red with Regret. Caleb's presence in Silver Creek stirred up even more trouble. His rough demeanor, his open hostility towards the townspeople, and his undisguised desire for revenge fueled the existing tensions, escalating the conflict to a dangerous level. He clashed with Buckley's deputies, engaged in fistfights in the saloon, and openly challenged anyone who dared to speak ill of his brother. He was a wild card, a loose cannon, and Caroline worried that his actions would jeopardize Sarah's efforts, would undermine their chances of freeing Jack. She tried to reason with him, to persuade him to be patient, to trust in Sarah's legal strategy, to avoid any further confrontations. But Caleb was consumed by anger, by a burning desire to avenge his brother, to make those responsible pay for their actions. They framed him. Caroline, he said, his voice raw with emotion, his eyes filled with a dangerous glint. They're trying to kill him. I won't let them. One evening, Caleb disappeared. Caroline searched for him, fearing the worst, her heart pounding with dread. She found him at the abandoned line shack where Higgins had been hiding, the place where Jack's troubles had begun. The shack was empty, but there were signs of a struggle, of violence. Bloodstains on the floor, overturned furniture, a broken window. Caroline's heart sank. She knew something terrible had happened. She followed a trail of blood leading away from the shack, towards the river that ran along the edge of the Bar K property. The river, usually a tranquil stream, was now swollen and muddy from recent rains, its waters churning with a dangerous current. As she approached the riverbank, she saw him.
Caleb.
Standing over a body, his clothes soaked with blood, his face a mask of grief and rage. The body was Bart Higgins. He was dead, his throat slit, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her mind reeling with horror. She knew what this meant. Caleb had killed Higgins. He'd taken the law into his own hands, seeking revenge for his brother. But in doing so, he'd sealed his own fate.
Caleb.
What have you done? She whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears. He looked at her, his expression blank, his eyes devoid of emotion. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice cold and hard. He deserved it. Caroline knew he was wrong. She knew that violence wasn't the answer, that revenge wouldn't bring Jack back, that it would only lead to more pain, more suffering, more bloodshed. But she also understood his pain, his anger, his desperation. She understood the primal urge to protect those we love, to avenge their wrongs, to seek justice in a world that often seemed devoid of it. We have to go, Caleb, she said, her voice urgent, her mind racing. We have to get away from here. Before they find you. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the fear in her gaze, the desperation in her plea. He knew she was right. He knew he couldn't stay. He knew he had to run. They left Higgins's body by the river, a grim testament to the cycle of violence, of revenge, of regret. They rode away into the darkness, leaving behind the scene of a crime, of a life taken, of a future shattered. The river ran red with regret, carrying with it the blood of a man, the tears of a woman, and the shattered dreams of two brothers. The weight of their actions, the consequences of their choices, would haunt them forever. The cycle had claimed another victim, and there was seemingly no end in sight. Chapter 16. Whispers of Betrayal in the Wind. Caroline and Caleb rode through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Silver Creek. They were fugitives now, hunted by the law, pursued by their own demons, their future uncertain. Caroline knew she was risking everything by helping Caleb. She was harboring a murderer, obstructing justice, defying the law. She could lose her ranch, her reputation, her freedom. But she couldn't abandon him, couldn't betray the loyalty she felt towards Jack, towards his brother. They found refuge in an abandoned mine shaft, hidden deep in the hills, a place where they could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. Caroline tended to Caleb's wounds, both physical and emotional. He'd been injured in the fight with Higgins, cuts and bruises that mirrored the deeper wounds of his soul. He was withdrawn, silent, his eyes filled with a haunting emptiness. "I didn't want to kill him, Caroline," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of their campfire. I lost control." Caroline understood. She'd seen the darkness in him, the rage that had consumed him, the desperation that had driven him to violence. She didn't condone his actions, but she empathized with his pain, with his loss, with his burning desire for justice. "I know, Caleb," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "But we have to figure out what to do now. We can't just keep running." They talked for hours, weighing their options, considering their possibilities. They knew they couldn't go back to Silver Creek, not with Buckley in control, not with the town turned against them. They knew they couldn't stay in the mine shaft forever, exposed to the elements, vulnerable to discovery. Caroline suggested they go to Dust Devil Junction, to seek Sarah's help, to explain the situation, to try and find a way out of this mess. Caleb was reluctant, distrustful of lawyers, of the legal system, of anyone connected to the law. He wanted to keep running, to disappear, to escape the consequences of his actions. But Caroline persuaded him, convincing him that Sarah was their only hope, that she was the only one who could help them, who could possibly clear Jack's name, who could expose Buckley's corruption. As they talked, a new worry gnawed at Caroline. She hadn't heard from Sarah in days, not since she'd returned to Silver Creek. She'd expected a message, an update, some word on Jack's case. But there had been nothing. Silence. She feared the worst. She feared that Buckley had discovered Sarah's investigation, that he had silenced her, that he had harmed her. The thought sent a shiver of dread down her spine, a cold wave of fear that threatened to consume her. "We have to go to Dust Devil Junction, Caleb," she said, her voice urgent, her eyes filled with a new determination. "We have to find Sarah. We have to make sure she's all right." Caleb nodded, his own fears mirroring hers. He knew that Sarah was their only link to Jack, their only hope for a future, their only chance at redemption. As they prepared to leave the mine shaft, the wind picked up, howling through the hills, carrying with it the whispers of betrayal, of danger, of uncertainty. They were riding into a storm of their own making, a storm that threatened to engulf them all. But they rode on, driven by love, by loyalty, by a desperate hope for a better tomorrow. The whispers of betrayal were strong, but their will was stronger. Chapter 17. The Reckoning at Raven's Gulch. The journey to Dust Devil Junction was fraught with peril. Caroline and Caleb traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the less traveled trails, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing pursuit. They arrived in Dust Devil Junction under the cloak of a new moon, the town shrouded in an eerie silence. The usual bustle and noise were absent, replaced by an unsettling quiet, a sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air. They went straight to Sarah's office, their hearts pounding with dread. The office was dark, empty, the door unlocked. There were signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, papers scattered across the floor, a broken lamp. Caroline's worst fears were confirmed. Something had happened to Sarah. Buckley had found her. They searched the office, desperately looking for a clue, a message, some indication of what had happened, of where Sarah might be. They found nothing. Caleb, his anger reignited, his grief fueled by fear, wanted to go straight to Buckley, to confront him, to demand answers, to make him pay. But Caroline restrained him, knowing that such a move would be reckless, suicidal. "We need a plan, Caleb," she said, her voice firm, her mind racing. "We can't just barge in there. Buckley's expecting us. He's waiting for us." They decided to seek out Jed Harper, Sarah's contact, the ex-deputy who had provided them with information about Buckley's corruption. They needed his help, his knowledge, his guidance. They found Harper at his cabin, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He'd heard the rumors, the whispers, the news of Higgins's death, of Caleb's flight, of Sarah's disappearance. "Buckley's got her," Harper said, his voice low and grim. "He's holding her at Raven's Gulch. It's an old, abandoned fort outside of town. He uses it for his dirty work." Raven's Gulch. The name sent a chill down Caroline's spine. It was a place of legend, a place of violence, a place of death. It was where Buckley took his enemies, where he tortured them, where he killed them. Caroline knew they had to rescue Sarah, had to confront Buckley, had to end his reign of terror. But she also knew it was a trap, a suicide mission. Buckley was waiting for them, expecting them, and he had all the advantages. "We have to go, Jed," Caroline said to the grizzled man, her voice unwavering. "We can't leave her there." Caleb joined her, his stance firm. "We'll get her back." They devised a plan, a desperate gamble that relied on surprise, on stealth, on the element of chaos. They would approach Raven's Gulch under the cover of darkness, using the element of surprise to their advantage. Caleb, with his experience as a tracker, would scout the area, identify the guards, assess the defenses. Caroline, with her knowledge of the terrain, would guide them through the treacherous landscape. Harper, with his knowledge of Buckley's tactics, would advise them on how to approach the fort, how to avoid the traps, how to reach Sarah. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. They were riding into a reckoning, a final confrontation with Buckley, a battle between good and evil, between justice and corruption. As they rode towards Raven's Gulch, the wind howled around them, carrying with it the whispers of death, of despair, of the final reckoning. The odds were stacked against them, the dangers were immense, but they rode on, driven by love, by loyalty, by a desperate hope to save Sarah, to free Jack, to end Buckley's reign of terror. The Gulch awaited, and with it, a battle that would decide everything. Chapter 18. A Trail of Tears and Second Chances. The approach to Raven's Gulch was treacherous, the landscape rugged and unforgiving. The crumbling fort stood silhouetted against the night sky, a menacing presence that exuded an aura of violence and despair. Caleb, using his tracking skills, identified the guards, their positions, their routines. Buckley had a small army protecting him, men loyal to him, men who were just as corrupt and ruthless as he was. Caroline, Caleb, and Jed Harper moved stealthily, using the shadows to their advantage, their movements silent and precise. They took out the guards one by one, their actions swift and efficient, their determination fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope to reach Sarah before it was too late. They infiltrated the fort, their hearts pounding, their nerves on edge. The interior was dark and damp, the air thick with the stench of decay and death. They moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their senses heightened, their awareness acute. They found Sarah in a cell, bound and gagged, her face bruised and swollen, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. She'd been tortured, interrogated, but she was alive. Caroline rushed to her, her hands trembling as she untied the ropes, her tears flowing freely as she embraced her daughter.
"Mama."
"You came," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, her body weak. "We're here, Sarah," Caroline said, her voice choked with emotion. "We're getting you out of here." As they prepared to leave, Buckley appeared, blocking their path, his face twisted with rage, his gun drawn. He was flanked by his remaining deputies, their weapons aimed at Caroline, Caleb, and Sarah. "You should have stayed away, Caroline," Buckley snarled, his voice cold and menacing. "Now you'll all die together." Caleb stepped forward, his own gun drawn, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You won't touch them, Buckley," he said, his voice a low growl. "You'll have to go through me first." A standoff ensued, the tension thick and palpable, the air crackling with the threat of violence. The two sides faced each other, their weapons drawn, their fingers on the triggers, their fates hanging in the balance. Suddenly, Jed Harper stepped forward, his hands raised, his voice calm and steady. "Buckley, it's over," he said. "I've sent word to the territorial marshal.
He's on his way."
You're finished." Buckley laughed, a harsh, derisive sound. "You're bluffing, Harper," he said. "You have nothing." But Harper stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "I have proof, Buckley," he said. "Proof of your corruption, of your crimes, of your involvement in the bank robbery, of Higgins's murder. I have witnesses. You're going down." Buckley's confidence wavered, his bravado crumbling, his eyes flickering with doubt. He knew Harper, knew his reputation, knew his integrity. He knew he was telling the truth. The deputies, sensing their leader's hesitation, began to waver, their loyalty tested, their fear growing. They lowered their weapons, their eyes darting between Buckley and Harper, uncertain of what to do. Buckley, realizing he was cornered, that he had lost, made one last, desperate move. He raised his gun, aiming it at Caroline, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Caleb shot him. The bullet struck Buckley in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground, his gun clattering on the stone floor. Buckley lay there, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He looked up at Caleb, his lips moving, trying to form words, but only a gurgle escaped his throat. Then he closed his eyes, his body going limp, his life extinguished. The remaining deputies surrendered, their weapons dropping to the floor, their faces pale with fear and resignation. The reign of terror was over. Caroline, Sarah, Caleb, and Jed Harper left Raven's Gulch, leaving behind the bodies, the violence, the darkness. They rode away, into the dawn, leaving a trail of tears and second chances. The trail was long and arduous, but it was a trail that led to freedom, to justice, to a new beginning. They had survived the reckoning, had faced their demons, had emerged victorious. The battle was won, but the scars would remain, reminders of the pain, the loss, the sacrifices they had made. But from the tears, a new hope bloomed, a hope for a future free from fear, free from corruption, free from the shadows of the past. Chapter 19. Embracing the dawn of a new life. With Buckley dead and his corrupt network dismantled, Jack was released from jail, his name cleared, his freedom restored. The territorial marshal, alerted by Jed Harper, arrived in Dust Devil Junction, taking charge of the investigation, arresting the remaining corrupt deputies, and initiating proceedings to bring justice to Silver Creek. Jack's reunion with Caroline was emotional, filled with tears, embraces, and whispered words of love and relief. They held each other tightly, their bodies trembling, their hearts overflowing with gratitude and a renewed sense of hope. Sarah, recovering from her ordeal, embraced her mother and Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and pride. She played a crucial role in their victory, her courage, her intelligence, her determination having helped to bring down a corrupt sheriff and free an innocent man. Caleb, despite his role in Higgins's death, was granted leniency, the judge recognizing the extenuating circumstances, the provocation, the years of hardship and injustice he had endured. He was given a suspended sentence, a chance to start anew, to build a life free from violence and revenge. They returned to Silver Creek, not as outcasts, not as fugitives, but as heroes. The town, humbled by the revelations of Buckley's corruption, shamed by their own prejudice and fear, welcomed them back, their apologies awkward, their expressions contrite. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a newfound respect, by a recognition of their courage, their resilience, their unwavering love for each other. The community that had once shunned them now embraced them, offering their support, their friendship, their forgiveness. Caroline and Jack, finally free from the shadows of the past, from the constraints of expectation, from the dangers of the frontier, began to build their new life together. They rebuilt the ranch, restored the fences, and healed the wounds that had been inflicted upon them, both physical and emotional. They found solace in the simple rhythms of frontier life, in the beauty of the landscape, in the companionship of their animals, in the love that had sustained them through the trials and tribulations they had faced. They married in a simple ceremony beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where they had buried Belle, the same tree that had witnessed their struggles, their triumphs, their enduring love. It was a small gathering, attended by Sarah, Caleb, Jedediah, and the few friends who had remained loyal to them throughout their ordeal. The ceremony was a celebration of their love, of their resilience, of their second chances. It was a testament to the power of forgiveness, of redemption, of the enduring human spirit. As they stood beneath the oak tree, the sun setting in the distance, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caroline and Jack embraced the dawn of a new life, a life filled with promise, with hope, with a love that had weathered the storms and emerged stronger, more vibrant, more enduring than ever before. The past was behind them, the future stretched before them, a vast, open landscape filled with possibilities. They were ready to embrace it, together, their hearts filled with gratitude, their spirits renewed, their love a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the frontier. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years passed, the seasons turning, the landscape changing, but the love between Caroline and Jack remained constant, a steady flame that burned brightly in the heart of Silver Creek. The ranch prospered, their lives intertwined, their bond unbreakable. Sarah, now a respected lawyer in Dust Devil Junction, visited often, bringing with her news of the outside world, of the changing times, of the encroaching modernity that was slowly transforming the frontier. She had found love herself, marrying a young doctor, a man who shared her passion for justice and her commitment to helping others. Caleb, having served his time and made amends for his past, had settled down on a small ranch near Silver Creek, finding peace in the solitude of the land, in the companionship of his animals, in the occasional visits from Caroline and Jack. He'd never fully escaped the shadows of his past, but he'd found a measure of redemption, a way to live with his regrets, to channel his anger into a more constructive path. Jedediah, now older and more grizzled, remained a steadfast presence on the ranch, his loyalty unwavering, his friendship a constant source of comfort and support. He'd become a surrogate grandfather to Sarah's children, sharing with them his stories of the Old West, of the hardships, the triumphs, the enduring spirit of the frontier. One evening, as Caroline and Jack sat on the porch, watching the sunset, their hands clasped together, their bodies leaning against each other, they reflected on their journey, on the trials they had faced, on the love that had sustained them. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Caroline said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a mixture of nostalgia and contentment. Jack nodded, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of the plains, his heart filled with gratitude.
"We have," he said.
"We've faced the darkness, and we've found the light." They talked about the past, about the whispers, the betrayals, the violence, the losses they had endured. But they also talked about the present, about the peace they had found, about the love they shared, about the future that stretched before them, uncertain but filled with promise. As they talked, a lone rider approached, a figure silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a young man, a stranger, his face hidden by the brim of his hat, his demeanor uncertain. He dismounted, his movements hesitant, his eyes searching theirs. He was looking for Jack Slade, he said, his voice trembling, his hands shaking. He was his son. Caroline and Jack exchanged a look of surprise, of shock, of disbelief. Jack had never spoken of a son, had never mentioned a child from his past. It was a secret he had kept buried deep within his heart, a secret that had now resurfaced, threatening to disrupt the peace they had found. Jack stepped forward, his face etched with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. He looked at the young man, searching his features, looking for a resemblance, a connection, a sign of the truth. The young man explained, his voice filled with emotion, his story unfolding like a forgotten chapter from Jack's past. He was the son of a woman Jack had known in Abilene, a woman he had loved, a woman who had died giving birth to their child. He'd been raised by relatives, never knowing his father, always searching for him, always longing for a connection. Jack listened, his heart aching, his mind reeling, his past colliding with his present. He saw the resemblance, the familiar eyes, the familiar features, the undeniable truth of the young man's claim. It was a final confrontation, not of guns and violence, but of hearts and horizons. It was a reckoning with the past, a challenge to the present, a test of the love that had sustained them through so much. Caroline, seeing the pain in Jack's eyes, the confusion in his expression, stepped forward, her hand reaching out to take his, her love a steady anchor in the storm of emotions. "We'll face this together, Jack," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a love that knew no bounds. "Just like we've faced everything else." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and a deep, hopeful blue. The final confrontation had arrived, not with a bang, but with a whisper of a past that had returned, a whisper of a future that was yet to be written. And as the stars began to appear in the vast, endless sky, Caroline and Jack, together with a son he never knew, stood on the porch of their ranch, ready to embrace whatever the dawn might bring. The horizon was vast, but their hearts were ready. Epilogue. The arrival of Jack's son, whose name was Ethan, brought a new dynamic to their lives, a new chapter to their story. He was a young man, eager to learn, eager to connect, eager to find his place in the world, in the family he had never known. Caroline welcomed him with open arms, her heart overflowing with a love that extended beyond her own immediate circle, a love that embraced the unexpected, the unknown, the challenges that life presented. She saw in Ethan a reflection of Jack, a reminder of the past, a promise of the future. Jack, initially hesitant and unsure, gradually opened his heart to his son, the walls of his past crumbling, the barriers of his regrets dissolving. He found in Ethan a connection to a life he had thought lost, a chance to reclaim a part of himself he had believed buried forever. They spent their days working the ranch, sharing stories, building bonds, forging a family. Ethan learned the ways of the frontier, the skills of a rancher, the values of hard work, honesty, and loyalty. He also learned about his father's past, about the hardships he had endured, about the love he had found, about the redemption he had achieved. Sarah and her family welcomed Ethan into their lives, embracing him as a brother, as an uncle, as a member of their growing clan. Caleb, too, found in Ethan a connection to his brother, a reminder of the bond they had shared, a chance to heal the wounds of the past. The ranch became a haven, a place of healing, a place of new beginnings. The whispers of the past faded away, replaced by the laughter of children, by the warmth of family, by the enduring love that bound them all together. Years passed, the seasons turning, the landscape changing, but the love between Caroline and Jack remained constant, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving frontier. They had faced the storms, had weathered the trials, had emerged stronger, more resilient, more in love than ever before. One evening, as they sat on the porch, surrounded by their family, watching the sunset, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude, Caroline looked at Jack, her eyes shining with a love that had transcended time, that had defied the odds, that had conquered all. "We made it, Jack," she said, her voice soft, her smile radiant. He nodded, his own eyes filled with a love that mirrored hers, a love that had endured, a love that would last forever. "We did," he said. "We did." And as the stars began to appear in the vast, endless sky, they sat together, surrounded by their loved ones, their hearts full, their spirits at peace, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a testament to the promise of second chances, a testament to the beauty of a life well lived, a love well earned, a future embraced with open arms and hopeful hearts. The vast horizon was theirs, filled with the promise of tomorrow, a tomorrow built on the foundations of love, loyalty, and a shared journey through the heart of the frontier.